Hi, everyone. So we'll just take 1 or 2 minutes to let everybody get into the room, and then we'll get started. Hopefully, everyone is doing well. It is Thursday, right? Thursday evening. Um, yeah, we should expect a few more people to join us. For anybody who hasn't taken one of these before, I am Chris Baskies. If you hear shouting in the background, I apologize. That might be my son in the bathtub. Um, but I'm Chris Baskies. I'm the Club Relations and Membership Manager at Ontario Cycling. Um, Tonight's presentation is session 2 of our Safe Sport series, which we had session 1 in September. We have a recording of that. So if you weren't part of that evening or want that recording, please let us know. We will make that available to you. Tonight is session 2. With us is Will Russell and Kristen Noonan of Sport Law. So they are going to go over the presentation. Will talked more about kind of Safe Sport 101, the first session, and tonight we'll, I think, hand over most of the reins to Kristen. But certainly if you have questions throughout, we've got a Q&A, we've got a chat, we can unmute you. So, feel free to basically pose it in whichever way you want. And we also have Pam Julian, the president and CEO of Ontario Cycling as well. So we'll get started, and whoever else joins us can then chime in after. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from Ottawa, which is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. I recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries, and I honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory. And Ontario Cycling extends its deepest respect to all First Nations people, both past and present, as the custodians of the beautiful land we reside on. Saying that, I will basically just flip it over to Kristen. This webinar, like I said, is being recorded, so if you happen to miss anything, don't worry. You can get that from us. But other than that, if you have a question throughout, don't hesitate. We'll kind of, I think, interject as the question gets posed. Yeah, there's tons, not a lot of people, so don't hold back with your questions. So Kristen, I'll pass it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to both you and Pam for having us here again tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'd look forward to continuing our conversation from session 1. Before I start sharing my screen, I'm wondering, we do have a small group. If in the chat box, you wouldn't mind maybe putting your role in cycling, just so we can see who we have on here, whether, it's coaches, cyclists, admin, just so we can kind of see who's joining us tonight as we talk through some of these safe sport actions that we can do. I don't know if they can. Do they have the ability, Chris, to type in the chat box?
Here's the no chat box is now open.
No.
It was
Okay.
closed.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, there, we're getting some. There we go. And yes, as we go through, feel free to unmute, raise your hand, chime in with a small group. We can ask questions and have some discussion and just keep the conversation going. All right, I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. Oh, Chris, I think you need to enable me to share my screen. Let me just get you all back on screen here. Perfect. Excellent. All right. So implementing safe sport. So today we're really going to talk about how we can get that into action. So sport law works with organizations of all levels, you know, right down to the grassroots with our local, our provincial, territorial, right up to the national level. A lot of what Will and I do is focus in the safe sport area with policies and implementation. So I'm looking forward tonight to really continuing on with what Will discussed in session 1. You know, we talked about why safe sport, kind of, you know, why it's important, where it came from. I mean, it's always been there, but it's at the forefront now, and really taking a stand to help create that positive environment, and really what it means to implement it. You know, we have to have our policies, we have our training. We talk about communication and engagement, and then the resources that go along with it, and really the evolution of, you know, where we started and where we are now. And that's what we're going to focus on now is taking a look at what we can do with those policies that we have in place and pull little bits from it, little tangible things that we can walk away with. So my goal here tonight is that by the end of this, you can have, you know, 2 or 3 things that you might be able to implement tomorrow or next week, or, you know, this season when it comes to safe sport. And it doesn't have to be, you know, these big daunting tasks. It can be little things that we're doing in everyday practice and competition that will help kind of create that environment and really focus on that safe sport. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, and that's my goal for all of you. So what is safe sport, right? We hear this, you know, and I know some coaches think, oh, it's another thing, you know, organizations talk about, oh, you know, what else are we getting thrown at us? But it's really important that this isn't just another checkbox, right? And it's not hard. So for me, when I think of safe sport, I think of that positive, inclusive, accessible environment, a place where our athletes and all participants can train, compete, can grow. And yes, it's in an environment that is free from all forms of maltreatment, you know, but it's more than that as well. And I know Will hears me say this all the time, but it's similar to what he talked about in session 1, when we talked about we're past that point of being reactive, right? We know it happens in our sport, it happens in all sports, and it's about taking that step to be proactive. When we show up to cycling, when we show up to sport, we don't go, I'm going to show up because I think this is going to be free from maltreatment, right? That's not what it's about. We show up because we're passionate about it, because we want to have fun, because we want to train, because we want to get better, right? We show up for all of that good. And that's what safe sport is about. It's not just the absence of bad, it's the presence of good. And that's what we need to remember. So safe sport involves everyone, right? We all play that role, no matter who we are, whether we're on the board, whether we're admin, whether we're staff, whether we're a coach, whether we're an athlete. We all play a part in this, right? We all bring that good. Yes, Will, go ahead.
Thanks. I was going to say how long it took to interject or interrupt is probably the better way to frame it.
Anytime.
I guess 2 things on this. One, the suggestion that safe sport is like, oh, we have a safe environment. And I'm going to repeat it here, but, you know, it's not just the absence of bad, it is the presence of good. Really, like, that's like the baseline that we should be looking to do, right? Like this, it's not the goal, right? You don't say we have a safe sport environment and then they were good. It's really just the entry point on this. It should be the default that we have a safe environment. And everybody's already heard me go on about this, but that I always find that safe sport is almost misleading or misnamed, because no one should walk into a sport environment and say, oh, welcome, Kristen, you're safe here. Probably was a given. Like, didn't think she would show up because she thought there was an element of danger by showing up to a cycling club. So really, our obligation, this is all part of it, but like, we want to be elevating beyond the baseline that is safe sport. The other one is that as we move ahead, you know, we look at the insurance issues, we look at complaints issues. This is relevant for everybody. And if we are staying up to speed, it can be incredibly expensive to deal with these issues without having the appropriate infrastructure in place. So I think the more we can spend on time and energy on education, on proactive measures to make our sport better, that's where we want to be. Because on the other side, you're talking tens of thousands to navigate a complaint process that can get messy very quickly. So I will now stop my first interruption and leave it there.
Yeah, love it. Interrupt anytime. That's why we work well together. So going back to the chat box, because I like to be interactive. This is our safe sport environment, okay? So similar to Will just saying, you know, it's not just we're showing up and be like, this is baseline. What does that look like? What should it include? So if you want to type in that chat box again, you're showing up to a race, to a practice, to train. What does a safe sport environment look like? And you can unmute if you want to and just chime in. Yes, fun and welcoming, absolutely. Fun is probably my favorite thing. Open, yes. A couple more coming in. Welcoming and friendly, yeah, absolutely. This is what we want, right? If we want our cyclists to keep coming back, if we want people to join, if we want people to stay in cycling lifelong recreationally, we have to create that environment for everyone, right? We need it to be safe, we need it to be equitable, and we need it to be inclusive. We want everyone to be a part of it. We need to be able to promote strength, resilience, and self-confidence. And again, this is not just in our participants, right? These are the coaches that are involved in the game, our marshals or our officials that are involved in our sport, right? We want this for everybody. Positive and fun. And yes, I'm putting a little heart beside that because that's my favorite thing, right? That's why we do things, is because we're having fun, we're smiling, we're enjoying it. And that is so important, right? We mentioned open and observable. So we're following the rule too, which we're going to dive into a little bit later. That is important. And I know it's something that Ontario Cycling follows. It ensures respect for our opponents, our officials, and all of our organizers. It allows for growth and development. And again, that's for everybody, and that's across all disciplines and all roles within cycling. And it encourages fair and meaningful competition. So this is what an environment looks like that is safe. You know, it's really all encompassing and it has all of that in there. So those are a couple things we want to focus on. And then we want to take a look at how do we get there? Okay, so we have this environment, but what do we need to have in place in order to have all of this? Okay, so it means that we have our policies and procedures in place. And we talked about a lot of that in session 1, right? That we have things in place. Not only so that we're having that positive environment and we're being proactive, but also if something happens, we know the procedures, we have everything in place to go through that process. Yes, Neil, we will be sending these out after, so absolutely. We have education and training available, right? And that's for everybody. And we're making sure that our coaches and officials are trained or certified, whether that be with specific, you know, in cycling, the NCCP, that's all of part of it. We're making sure our volunteers, anyone else who's involved in it, are safe sport screened. Open and observable again, so that goes with the rule of 2, making sure that any of our interactions include that. We make sure our participants are free from all forms of maltreatment, which we're going to talk about with some of the prohibited behaviors here in a little bit. And then if something were to happen, that our participants at all levels know where to go if we have a concern or we want to file a complaint. Okay, so we need to have all of those in place in order to create that environment. And some of those are behind the scenes, but that's kind of what helps us get to where we need to be. So, in order to have, you know, an environment that's free from all forms of maltreatment, we need to know what those prohibited behaviors are. because part of our role too is be able to speak up if we see something. Whether we're in a competitive club, whether we're in a recreational club, whether we're dealing with minors or all adults, it is important to know these prohibited behaviors. So we talked a little bit about this last time. Does anyone remember what are the 2 most common prohibited behaviors or forms of maltreatment in sport? Go ahead and either shout it out or put it in the chat box. Got harassment. We see a lot of that these days. That's in the news. Any other input or guesses? Yeah. Yeah. We see sexual maltreatment. Good. All right, Will, go for it.
I was just going to ask a question for if everybody can define all of these in their own words, not on the OSIC or the UCCMS definition, because those are very long.
Well, I'll let you define them after. So the 2 most common are psychological maltreatment, and that you hear of a lot, right? That could be anything from derogatory comments, forcing athletes to do weigh-ins. That can be verbal assault, whether it be in person or online. That can be taking food away, isolating athletes, right? That happens a lot, threatening athletes. And the other one's neglect. That's the other one too. Whether it be omission of adequate care, not allowing recovery time or forcing them to compete when they're still injured, not supervising them, putting them in situations that's out of their, ability range. So those are the 2 most common. Often we hear about physical and sexual because those are the most egregious, but the common ones in sport are psychological and neglect. So Will, do you want to touch on some of them?
Yeah, I guess 2 things. I think one, we want to remember that safe sport is not about policing criminal activity. So a lot of these issues say, well, that's not a crime. Well, that's the whole point, because if they're criminal behavior, they should be going to the police. So on that first piece, anything in the news recently that we think may touch on potential safe sport violations? Anything involving a coach maybe who lost their job before they started? Involving an NHL hockey team. Right? So if we look at what happened in the situation involving Babcock, there was a lot of situations there, which would be, were they criminal? No. Were they violations of labor law? Potentially. That's not relevant for this piece. But there were things that they were doing to assert power, where there was an imbalance between young athletes, and yes, some of them are older, but also younger athletes, where there was a power imbalance to assert a level of control and dominance within the situation. And those are often what we see in terms of the psychological maltreatment, and goes into the other pieces. And that really is one that I think is a challenge to navigate, because we are not as it's not as familiar to us, but it really is about the environment that we're making. And it's sort of the opposite of what was described about the open, friendly, encouraging environments, psychological maltreatment. The other one I just want to speak to very briefly is this issue of boundary transgressions. Does anybody have a sense of what that means? And it has nothing to do with your neighbor getting on your lawn.
No.
Any thoughts on what that one entails or what that involves? So, boundary transgressions are these use of It's all, I think the easiest way to see it is sort of this escalation of minor, and it can potentially major, but typically minor pushes to see where the line is, to push and say, you know, is it, that's exactly it. Neil, thank you for taking the words I'm out, but you know, that you're just basically crossing the line, but just ever so slightly, or coming close to the line to see if you can push it, to see if where you can flex it. And you know, it's that old thing about you know, raising a water very slowly, you know, when a frog won't jump out of it. It's something akin to that, is that you're just trying to see what incremental steps you could take to shift the environment to it. But can, you know, if you sort of came into it from 0 to 100 would be very hostile, but there's this gradual increasing piece of violating what the boundaries, violating those limits, but they may not in and of themselves, that singular act may not be something that would warrant significant discipline, but taken in the context, looking at the entirety of the situation, can actually be a very serious sign of inappropriate behavior or the development to very, very inappropriate behavior. So that's one I think is important to understand and to note, and that it's one that I think with the issue of psychological maltreatment is one that are not necessarily criminal activities, but are still ones that are insidious that we do not belong in sport. So for my second interruption, I'll now be quiet.
No, I think that's great. Boundary transgressions, obviously that was one of the newer prohibited behaviors that was added with the last update. And I think it is really important because we see it in sport, and it often does go hand in hand with grooming, right? And especially that's when we're kind of seeing the boundaries there being pushed, which obviously then can lead to sexual maltreatment. And a boundary transgression can be something as little as that accidental touching, right? You know, or a little brush by and you're like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It can be, you know, sending a text one-on-one and being like, oh, sorry, that was to the wrong person. It's those little things that they often pretend are innocent, but they're really just testing the waters to see how this person reacts. So it is important to know that because they do all kind of go hand in hand there. If you have more questions, we're not going to go through all the prohibited behaviors, but if you do have questions, feel free to let us know, or we'll have some time at the end too, if you're not sure on those. But just wanted to highlight kind of the two main ones, because we hear about the sexual and physical, and sometimes those are easier, right, as they come through, but sometimes it's harder with the psychological and neglect, you know, to have the facts to come through, but they're the most prevalent. So on the flip side of things, we're going to talk about what is not safe sport, right? Because as you encourage people to come forward, you know, as this is brought to the front, sometimes you're going to get those other complaints, or what I call complaining, that are not safe sport. And there's a difference between complaining and a formal complaint. So these are just some examples here. They're obviously not exhaustive, but not being picked for a competition or making a competition, not being selected to a team, right? Uneven playing time. Now that's different in cycling, but those are not safe sport, right? Disagreeing with an official, not liking somebody, you know, on your team or your coach, or consequences for athletes who break rules or miss curfew, right? Those are not safe sport. And Will, I am going to pass it over to you on this one, because when we get into code of conduct, right, that's different. So Will, what is your favorite example that you use these days with your poo-poo head?
Yeah, like there are examples where people don't like each other and have had a long-standing relationship and call each other bad names. I don't know. I don't think I've called Kristen a poo-poo head yet. I don't know if it'll ever happen, but we do need to make sure that we don't, and I recognize where I'm sitting, the strangeness of saying it, so we don't over litigate or over lawyer situations. And there are rooms for conflict, right? And I think we need to draw the line between what is truly a safe sport complaint, where is something that like you probably shouldn't be doing, we need to have a conversation, and what is just like conflict that arises in sport. Does that help, or do you want me to go more detail about
No,
people head?
that's great. I just saw Chris's comment come in there, so I'm, yeah, there's some great training in there, and we'll talk about some of that too. Thank you, Will. So tonight we're going to talk about what you can do. So what, you can do as an organization, as a coach, as an athlete, to kind of walk away or take away things from this tonight that you can really focus on. We kind of alluded to it before, but safe sport is everyone's responsibility, whether you're a competitive club, a recreational club, whether you're working with minors, whether you're only working with adults. There's parts of this that applies to everyone, whether you realize it or not. There's so many different levels of sport. There's different disciplines in sport. The same thing applies to safe sport. There's all different levels. So, it could be something that affects you directly, or it might be indirectly, or it could be something as simple as you recognize a behavior that's maybe not okay, and you stand up and you say something, right? So you might think, well, this doesn't really apply to me, or I'm not dealing with minors. But that doesn't matter, because it happens with adults too. How many times, you have maybe a male and a female coach, or you have more male riders and one or two female riders, and you see, someone slap someone on the bum, or a comment being made, right? That happens in sport. So maybe your role is just speaking up or saying that's not okay, or talking to the person that something happened to. So we all have a role. So I'm not going to go through all these right now, because we're going to touch on them, and what we can do as an organization, as a coach, as administration, just to make sure that we are providing that environment that is safe for everybody involved in cycling. So our website. So I hope you've all been to Ontario Cycling's website, because they have a fantastic safe sport website. So we like to see safe sport kind of on the front of everybody's website, so that you're not having to look for safe sport, right? Have it right there, so they're not searching for the tab. If somebody wants information, if somebody does want to file a complaint, or if someone's just looking for some help of where to go, we don't want them digging through our sites. We want it to be somewhere that's visible. We want to showcase our commitment to safe sport and have information there. We want to have our policies, our code of conduct, maybe a link to the UCCMS, the Canadian Sport Helpline, right? That's important if someone is looking for resources or where to go, whether it be in safe sport or other areas as well. Reporting processes, and links to, OSIC or abuse-free sport, or the independent third party. And I know Ontario Cycling does a good job of that, connecting to Cycling Canada's independent third party, right? It's all there on the website, so that if somebody goes there, they can see that information. It talks about open and observable environments, which is really important. It's nice to see that, that's kind of on the forefront, because that's really something simple that helps create that positive environment and really helps eliminate the opportunity for some of that bad behavior to happen. I know there's a link for the training and education, which we'll talk about later too. And I know Chris just put that in the chat box as well, another e-learning module there. And true sport principles. So that's something that some organizations, some coaches, some people can kind of take the pledge and be a part of true sport. And we'll talk about that too. I don't know if Ontario Cycling is part of that or not. Yes, awesome. It's really just about values and what we want to create, and it goes hand in hand with everything safe sport, because it's that proactive piece. So this is something simple. If you're a club and you don't have a safe sport tab, or you don't have a website, great information, copy it right from Ontario Cycling, because theirs is great. They have all of this there. So something simple that's important for your members, for your athletes. Screening. So this is another part that, yeah, it takes some resources, it takes some work. But when you are working with athletes, when you're an organization, when you're a club, it's really important to screen the people who are working with them. And there's different forms of screening. It doesn't have to be necessarily a formal, EPIC or vulnerable sector check. There's different things, but it is important. I know, I coached provincially for quite a few years here. And it was part of policy to do background screening on coaches. And I can tell you not once did I get asked for any screening, right? And unfortunately, that's happening, especially as we get to smaller organizations, whether they don't have the time or the resources, but it is something that's really important. You know, whether it's completing an application form for that role, screening disclosure form is one I really like too, because obviously not everything's going to get picked up on a criminal record check, but something like a screening disclosure form specifically asks the coach or the volunteer, you know, have you ever been dismissed from a coaching role? Do you ever have any sanctions or discipline from a governing sport organization? So it just asks those other questions that might not get picked up, or maybe they've come from a different sport. Getting reference letters, having them do the training orientation, they're all little things, but it's just helping protect everyone in your organization, and obviously helping protect your athletes as well. So it's something little, but it is important. And then these I won't go into, but they're just the different levels of your criminal record checks that you can do. Your EPIC's just a little bit more enhanced, and then your vulnerable sector as well. Any questions on screening before I move on? Good. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Just on the point of screening, a lot of folks will say, well, I can't do all of this. It's okay to have a realistic assessment of your capacity. That's not to say that it excuses you from doing nothing, but a process that reflects your capacities, what you can do, is better than a massive, perfect policy and procedure that you do not do at all. Right. So I always do encourage that, like, there can be sort of the platinum standard, and if you don't have the capacity, identify what you can do and put that in place, because a lower tier, let's say, functional policy that's put in place and actually implemented is better than a gigantic document that gathers dust.
Absolutely. Thank you, Will. And that's important, right? Every little piece helps. And you're better to focus on the small things you can do versus this large thing that you can't do. Rule of 2. This is one I love to talk about, and this is one that seems to scare so many people. And I love that, you know, this is one I know is followed with Ontario Cycling. We talk about open and observable. And it's something I think that can be done easily. But right away, people think about, well, that's going to cost more money if I have to have another person, or, well, this is what we always do, or, you know, we've always just done this, but this is where we have to have that change, that shift. And one of the things I think of is, I said this before, of like, I remember when seatbelts came in and everyone was like, oh, I can't do that. I don't know. Like, do I really? And now 35 years later, guess what? We get into a car and put it on and don't even think about it. And that's what really this rule of 2, I think it just becomes normal practice. So really all it is that you have more than one person when you're working with athletes or participants, or that you're in an open and observable environment that's justifiable, right? And we're going to go through on the next couple slides, and I have some examples. And I think the number one takeaway from this that I can give everyone tonight is that this simple practice is in place not only to protect the athlete or the participant, but it's there to protect you, because you don't want to be putting yourself into a vulnerable or compromising situation that could be perceived or looked at any different than it is. So I think, you know, for everyone's sake here, this is really important for yourself, because you want to protect yourself as a coach, as admin, as a board member. So that's just something that I want to say, that, you know, it is important, and it's not just for minors either. You know, anywhere there's a power imbalance, anywhere where people, you know, are working together there, it's really important just to be aware of this. So rule of two in action, and this is right from the Coaching Association of Canada. And it's really just, you know, how do you use the rule of two? What do you do? So working as a team. So that's where, you know, if you are working with athletes, that you have a second screened coach or volunteer or parent with you, that you're not, you know, one-on-one with an athlete. And we mentioned this last time too, you know, if you're trail riding, should you really be going into these secluded areas, you know, one-on-one with an athlete? And again, you don't want to be in that situation yourself. So remaining open to the public, making sure that, you know, when you are training and practicing, that it's open and observable. Transportation. So again, making sure that you're not traveling one-on-one, that you have at least 2 athletes or multiple participants when you're going through transportation. Making sure you're being sensible. So if you're traveling with a group of athletes or you're traveling, you know, somewhere else, that you make sure that you have the same gender as your athletes. And then communication, and that's making sure that it's not one-on-one. So the rule of two applies not only, you know, in person, but also online through electronic communication. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So that's just kind of what it looks like, you know, and I know it is in Ontario cycling's policies, so this is important to follow. So rule of two in action. So just a couple scenarios here that I want to go through. So maybe you travel, maybe you don't, but we'll just go through this example. So an athlete comes to your hotel room to talk about their race. What can you do? Okay, so you can invite them in, step out in the hallway, or tell them you'll meet them in the lobby. Okay, so in the chat box or out loud if you want, just put a 1, 2, or 3. What do you think the best option is here? Good. Seeing mostly 3s. Awesome. So it seems pretty common sense. And now if they come to your hotel room, don't invite them in. If it's a quick question, step out in the hallway, answer. But if you're going to have a discussion, if you're going to talk about performance, if you're going to talk about different things, go down into the lobby. Thank you, Dave. Go down into the lobby, right? It's open and observable. And this may seem like common sense, but I want to share this example. I was working with the Olympic softball team before they went to the games. And, you know, lots of emails back and forth, really focusing on safe sport. And we had some of the athletes come in and speak to some of the coaches. And so I met some of them for the first time face to face, you know, and right away they're like, "Oh, you're Kristen Noonan." And I was like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Yeah, you're the one that won't let us meet with coach in his hotel room anymore." And at first I was like thinking of all these things I've been doing with them to make sure it's safe and positive when they travel and they go places. And I was almost a little bit offended at first. I was like, that's what they think of me. And then, you know what? I was like, I'm okay with that, because that means they're listening, and that means they actually change their practice, because they used to have meetings one-on-one in the coach's room after games, right? And didn't think anything of it. And they're young adults, you know, they are over the age, they're, you know, mostly in their 20s, but that's what they were doing. And so it's, although it seems common sense, a lot of things, that's how it was done. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to take that as a win, because now they're not doing that. All right, so another one, an athlete's traveling to a competition with a coach who's another gender. What can you do, right? And this is also the responsibility of not only the coaches, but also the club or the organization. So we want to make sure that there's the same gender coach or chaperone traveling with them. And that's for safe sport, but it's also for overall safety. We want to make sure that we are following the rule of two during transportation. So whether that be taking a van, taking a bus, jumping on a plane, anything, right? We want to have that in mind. And we want to make sure when we're traveling that athletes are never sharing a room with a person in authority. And that's really important as well. And it's just something to think of when you're traveling or in different situations where there's also change rooms involved, right? That this is really important. Okay, last example here. A coach needs to talk to a cyclist about their behavior or performance. What is acceptable, right? Some coaches think, wow, you know, with rule of two, I can't do this or I can't do this, but you can, right? So before or after training, pull them aside. Whether there's, you know, other athletes, other people still around, you're still open and observable, right? If you're still in that training environment, that's okay. Okay. If you are going to have, you know, in a separate room or a meeting room, have the door open, have another coach or staff or volunteer admin with you. And if it's going to be one-on-one, make sure you're in a public place with people around. It could be in, you know, the lobby, common area. There's different things that you can do so that you are creating that rule of two guideline and that environment. Obviously, if there's an emergency and something happens, our number one goal is, you know, that doing no harm and making sure they're okay. So there may be times when there's an emergency and you have to transport someone to a hospital. Okay, these are guidelines and we still have to be realistic, but there are simple things that can be done so that we're still following this. So sports specific. So I want to turn it over to any of the people here to see, you know, what other situations arise in cycling that might be different. I know we talked about, you know, if there's a flat tire or a mechanical issue with a bike during a ride. We mentioned drop rides, right? So I want you to think what policies does your club have in place, or do you follow? You know, what do you have set up so that there, you know, when situations happen in cycling, you know what to do. So does anyone want to share either different situations or have questions specific to cycling with the rule of two? What about policies around injury? If someone gets injured during a race? No. All right. Well, if anyone has any, you know, situations or scenarios specific to cycling that they want to ask or think about, you can chime in at the end as well. But something to think about when you go back to your club or you're on a ride. Think about something specific that kind of pops up with this, with cycling, you know, and what you would do. All right. Oh, yeah, Will, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, rather than think about a safe sport, rather just what are some of the steps you can do to increase people's feelings of safety and inclusion? To focus on the good rather than the bad, to quote someone from earlier today. So like on that cycle, within the context of cycling, like what are those positive steps that we can do to make people feel safe and secure in the environment? To focus on, you know, the creation of the good rather than simply the absence of harm. Is there anything that folks can think about?
Yeah, Neil, go ahead if you want to unmute. Are you able to unmute, Neil? There we go.
How's that?
Yep, perfect.
There we go. I'm thinking of like a big group ride where you've got a bunch of people, right? And maybe somebody's not having the best day and they decide, okay, I'm just gonna drop off the back here. Maybe it's an area it's not the safest to be riding home or back to the starting spot by themselves. Have a policy in place with the team that a rider chaperoned back by two people. So there's always two people that drop back and, you know, ride back to the starting place together. And then that way it's out there and, you know, made a policy before the ride even gets going.
Absolutely. Love that. And that's where we want to be proactive, is think of those situations that could arise so that when it does happen, we're not scrambling and we know what to do. And like you said, something just as simple as that. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we need to educate our volunteers for sure. Yeah, I would have this apply to everyone and everybody, every club. Absolutely. Yeah, because it protects everyone, right? Awesome. Okay, let me. Okay, we're going to talk about social media and electronic communication. So I think social media is pretty easy. We talk about it a lot. Really, that's any way that we're sharing content, right? We use this in our personal lives. We use it in sport. We use it with our team to share information. But there is good ways and bad ways in sport. And the rule of two applies during electronic communication. And electronic communication is a little bit different than social media. Social media is about sharing and giving information. Electronic communication is really about having that conversation, that back and forth. And that's where we need to be careful, because we don't want to be doing one-on-one messaging with our athletes. And these could include, emailing, texting, Facebook Messenger, anything that's really going back and forth. So that's different than social media when you're putting a post out there. Okay, this is actually having a conversation and communicating back and forth. So I'm going to break it down a little bit with some of the platforms. So I want you to just take a second right now and think, as a club, as a coach, as an athlete, what are some of the platforms that are being used right now in sport? And we know there is a ton out there. We know we use a lot personally. And we also know that there's only a few that are ones that should be used in sport. So here's a bunch right now that are out there, right? We're using them, our kids are using them. This is not all inclusive. We know there's some more out there. Some of them are appropriate, some of them are not. But I do want to highlight right off the bat, Snapchat is not one we should be using in sport. Okay, so that hands down right now, that's a no, because it is not open and observable. Okay, so out of all the platforms, that one, whether, we're admin, coaches, managers, officials, that's one we don't want to be using. Okay, so if we are emailing and texting our athletes, and I'm going to talk about, let's say 13 and above, right? Anything that's under kind of that, really, we're just communicating with the parents. We shouldn't be going through the athletes at that age. And then anyone that, is an adult or above 18, 19, obviously we don't have to be copying parents. But just, we want to make sure that when we're texting or when we're emailing, it's in a group. And again, if they're kind of in that middle age, that we're also copying the parents or their guardians. Apps like Heya, Team Snap are great because, again, it's a group for everyone. We could have attendance in there. Any of these here on the screen, you want to make sure that it's non-personal, communications. It's about the race, the competition, the practice. And again, if they're under 18, you're including the parents and guardians. If they're under 13, it's really only going to the parents and guardians. And even if they are adults, that you're still sticking to sport specific and it's non-personal. If we're working with apps like Facebook, Instagram, X, these are used a lot. Like, I know Facebook as a parent myself, this is probably the number one thing that we're used, but it's used more in a social media way, right? They talk about when competition is, when games are, when practices are. It's not used as Facebook Messenger where we're going back and forth. So these are good if they're more used for social media, but not used one-on-one for messaging or talking with, athletes. So we want to make sure that anything we're sending is in a group, not one-on-one. No different than rule of two. And then things like TikTok and Snapchat, right? Those are ones we don't need to be friends with our athletes, especially when they're minors. And these are kind of ones that are no's. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so sending out emails and stuff like that, if you are emailing the other Zach or maybe somebody who's a bit younger, 18, 19, 20 or something like that, would it be appropriate to kind of say, who would you like to have on the email chain, as opposed to just picking the other person to be honest? just kind of a thought, right? Because if you're picking the person that's kind of someone you selected as the third person in the discussion, or would it be more appropriate to have them feeling more comfortable by asking them who would they like to have on the email chain?
Yeah, you could, like, I mean, kind of the natural is if they are, you know, 17, 18, whatever, if it's parents, or whoever they've given for their contact, or if you have another coach or manager or, you know, someone at the club, then that's also an avenue. But yeah, if there's someone else that they would want, that's fine too. But it's just having that extra person there so that you're still following the rule of 2. Or if you have multiple athletes, right, it's sending it out that it's all in group. But yes, if it's something that's one-on-one, you know, more personal, still to do with the sport, then, you know, it's finding out whether, again, it's another coach or parent or someone that they want. Absolutely. Any other questions when it comes to electronic communication? We'll talk a little bit more here with some of these guidelines. I think the biggest thing to remember when we're communicating is that you are a coach or a person in authority or administrator, and we want to make sure that we're behaving that way. We want to make sure any emails, any texts, any messages that are going out are professional, unambiguous, and they're on topic. And I think this next one is huge because we all use emojis, right? Different emojis can be interpreted different ways. So be very careful if you're communicating with athletes with what emojis you are using, right? And that's even where those boundary transgressions come in, right? Using little emojis or putting these little thing in there. So that's something to be careful with. And then not deleting your communication history. So your communication history can be asked from parents or guardians. It can be asked from your organization, and you have to be able to provide that. So any electronic communication you have on any platform, make sure that you are keeping it and not deleting it. We'll just give you 1 second and then you can chime in. Just in terms of social media, athletes will search your profiles, right? Be aware of that. You will also stumble upon your athlete's social media. And sometimes, you know, different things with code of conduct can come into play. So just being careful with that, making sure, you know, you never create a fake profile. You're not accepting friend requests if you don't have to. We want to keep it professional. They don't need to know what you're doing Friday night or with your family. It's keeping those boundaries of the professional and the sport. Go ahead, Will, chime in.
Yeah, it's really just to say, like, the law is evolving on social media and communication, and like we've now got to the point that a thumbs up on a text can form the basis of a legally binding contract. So the law is evolving on social media, and it's not super direct on the safe sport, but just to know that like we are having this evolution of recognizing that communication is changing, and that we do need to understand how that works. And what are your thoughts, Kristen, about how do you respond to an email or a message, like on WhatsApp, for example, directly from someone, maybe a minor? How would you deal with that situation?
WhatsApp, I don't know. I haven't used in years, but if that happens, I will, if it's a text or a message, I will include their parent or I will include another coach when I respond. And, you know, we've had it too where an athlete has done that. And I think this is where it's important at the start of your season is having a meeting, whether it's with the athletes, as an organization, with the parents, and kind of laying out, right? Like I know we have policies and we have templates, and it says this is how I'm going to be communicating with the athletes, or this is how we communicated at the club, you know, and parents can also chime in and say, no, I would prefer this communication. And that's one thing we need to be aware of as coaches and clubs is we can't force anyone to be on a certain platform. I can't say you have to be on Instagram because I'm going to post things there. You have to provide alternatives. And just letting athletes know, you know, Will, that you know, I won't add this, or I won't do that. I did that when I used to be a teacher, and I had, you know, a lot of those grade 6 girls, and they wanted to be my friend. And I said, I will not be anyone's friend. And same when I was coaching the provincial team, I was like, I will not be your friend on Facebook. And I had to say that outright, and they understood, just become different roles. And that's important to kind of lay that out there at the start. And I often tell parents too, right? As a coach, I'm held to these standards. I'm not going to be messaging one-on-one to your athletes. And I would expect the same from them, that they're not going to be messaging me one-on-one as well and putting me in that situation. It's important to be upfront about that right at the get-go.
There was a comment about blind copy should be used for group emails. That's a good point. I would also mention that, like, double check what your listserv access rules are, because sometimes you'll send to, you know, U18 team at, and depending on what you can do, sometimes you can actually access and get everybody's emails on that. So it is, you know, using that BCC, even if you are using a listserv, can be a really good way to protect everybody's information. And then also avoid the unfortunate reply all rather than the reply, which I'm sure we are all cursed with on at least a weekly basis.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something simple. You can, you know, you and say the other coach or someone can have your email showing, and then everyone else can be blind copied for sure. Yeah. Any other questions on that? Excellent.
Hi,
Yeah.
Kristen, I just want to point out too as well that all of the things that you're talking about, and when we have clubs that are recreational clubs that only have adults and they do group rides and they do all these things, all of these things, replace the word coach with ride leader. Replace the word athlete with a participant or a club member. Because at the end of the day, even with adults, there's inappropriate behavior that does occur. There's boundary transgressions. There's, you know, intimation that might be taken the wrong way. All these different pieces can happen just as easily on a ride, at a club ride on a Monday night, as they can between an athlete and their coach. So I think it's really important to recognize that you can just switch the language and switch the title of whoever the person in authority is. And as a ride leader, you are a person in authority.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for that, Pam, for sure. Yeah, and often, like, we'll say person in authority, because it's not just, I say coach a lot because we do deal with a lot of coaches, but it's not just the coach. It's any person, like you said, ride leader, admin, it could be board members, could be staff, right? A lot of this also applies in the workplace, right? It's not just, you know, on the trail or wherever we are, it's workplace too. So for sure. Thank you for that. Okay, we'll keep going on here. Oh, all right. So I'm not going to go through all this. This is really just a resource, travel checklist, right? And again, I know not all of you are probably traveling with teams or going things, but just little things that we've talked about, just something to keep in mind, right? And this could be more at the club level, when you're going place, when you're picking people to go. And it's the same of just having your two people in authority, making sure you have, you know, each gender covered. Everybody has their safe sport screening. We talk about athletes sharing a room, making sure they're not with a person in authority, right? So I won't go through all that, but it's just a little checklist prior to travel of things that you should be thinking of, whether you're a coach, whether you're admin, whether you're a club. Really important. And one thing I do want to highlight at the end, though, is that safe sport reporting process, right? Whether you're at home, whether you're going to a provincial event, whether you're going to a national event, whether you're going internationally, if something were to happen, do you know where to go? And that is important for the cyclists, maybe their parents. It's important as a leader, right? So those are just little things to check off, you know, before you're going to be traveling. And then there's something here for during travel as well. And again, it's just a little checklist, just a little resource. Talks a little about, right, if you're doing any room checks, about any, you know, rules, safety. And then at the bottom too, the true sport, about representing, right? If you're representing cycling, you're representing yourself, your club, your sport. Just little things to think about. So they're in there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but little things to think about when you're traveling with athletes, especially minors, but not just minors, with anyone. And these are tips, same thing. This is just another resource to think about. And, you know, most of them could be common sense, but some of them change, and we get into those little boundary transgressions. Like, it's okay if you are touching an athlete to help with technique. If you ask permission, it's not okay to do it repeatedly or frequently or unexpectedly. It's those little things that make it okay and not okay. You know, it's okay to do room checks with another coach. It's not okay to do a room check alone. It's okay to have team or group activities, and especially in cycling, that probably happens a lot. It's not okay, you know, to have athletes coming hang out at your home, or an athlete alone hanging out with you. That's not okay. So this will be in there, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's just little tips that, you know, you can provide coaches, or you can have in your club, that is important for any person in authority. Okay, we're going to talk about normalization a little bit. I'm just going to pop these up on the screen. Right, and this happens at all levels. This happens in all sports. Some of this is still happening, right? And this is what we want to change. We want to kind of change that conversation. We want to make it so this isn't normal. We don't want to say, oh, it's just an old boys club, right? That's just them, or it's always been like this. And this is where we can step in and kind of change that, right? And we talk a little bit about, you know, maybe you're hearing that in your club, or you're seeing things, and maybe you can just step up and say, hey, that's not okay, or let's change it, or it doesn't have to be that way. You know, if there are comments being made, or practices being done, you know, we talked about, and you'll see it there, about, you know, exercising to get better and for development is awesome, and that's okay. Exercising as a form of punishment is not okay, right? And that's the difference. So it's just changing some of the narrative, that it might have been done that way in the past, but that doesn't make it okay now. And we just want to shift that a little bit. Reporting. So this is something to, as a leader in sport, we want to make sure that we know where to go, our participants know where to go, and it's kind of that safe place that someone can talk to you. So if it's something minor, right, that they can talk to a screened adult, that they can go to the sport organization, that they know that there's an independent third party that they can go to, or if it's something urgent, they can contact the police or 911. So it's important to know that what our options are when reporting. And I know right on the Ontario Cycling Safe Sport pages, they have all that information, right? And that's really important. And I know, I think Cycling Canada, you have the link there that has the complaint submission form, right? So knowing that that's available and that's an option if something does happen. Yes, go ahead, Neil.
It's the question because of what's happened before with like across Canada in the US with all kinds of different sports. Because there's been multiple cases where complaints have been made and it's just being swept under the rug, right? And then it goes to another level and it's swept under the rug kind of idea, and it just continues. Policies in place that a complaint gets made and something there that says, okay, this is going to be the follow-up from it, and this is going to be the reporting from it to keep people accountable. So that way it was addressed, and it doesn't just, you know, the athlete feel or whomever it may be feels like, oh, well, it wasn't addressed. It's not, you know, and they're afraid to go to the next level. But
Yeah.
it's made accountable that it is going to be taken to the next level and there will be something coming out of this.
Yeah. And that's important because, you know, things do happen in sport, unfortunately. And there has been things that we've seen where it's covered up, or it's not dealt with, or, oh, we'll just let this season kind of pass by, and then, you know, it's not something we have to deal with it. And sometimes it's on purpose, and sometimes it's because they don't have the practices or procedures in place. And that's why, you know, we have the independent third party, is so that it is dependent and it's not someone, you know, within the organization, because sometimes too, that complaint is against someone who has, you know, a variety of roles in the organization, and that comes into effect too. So it's really important to have that independent third party so that it is dealt with fairly and transparent. Will, I know you can probably chime in here shortly, but the other Neil has their hand up, so go ahead, Neil.
What what if anything is being done or can we do it? Like, it's awesome that we have all these reporting forums, but the hard part is actually getting people to do it. So how can we tackle that?
I think this is a step in the right direction. Yeah, we'll go ahead, right, by having this independent, because so many people are worried it's going to come back on them, or it's going to be a he said, she said, or it's just going to get buried. And I think that's really important. We're trying to move away from that and have this independent. But Will, this is more your area, so I'm going to let you take over.
This isn't my line, but I'm going to steal it. Organizations move at the speed of trust. So a lot of what we have to do is not just say, hey, here's what we have, feel free to use it, but we need to provide education, we need to provide the assurance, and we need to sort of live the values that we're trying to express about of openness and inclusiveness. So people have confidence that we are actually walking the walk in this. I think that one of the most significant issues that has plagued sport, no one has said, oh, we don't have enough of an understanding of what it is to not harass someone, right? Like there hasn't been enough. It's not like we haven't had policies that say don't harass people. We had them for a long time. That hasn't been our failing. We haven't had inadequate legal process. We've had a lot of really good panels provide, very clear and fair decisions. What we have, one of the key challenges we've had is, where do I go with an issue? We have a prime example from a certain sport, which I will not name, but we can all guess which one, where things went to the board. And one of the challenges is that even if a board is well-intentioned in their efforts to resolve an issue, and in some cases involving serious allegations of criminal behaviors, they have a fiduciary obligation to act in the best interest of an organization. And that puts them in a really tough spot, because for most of the time, allegations or issues of safe sport are not going to put the organization in a good light, even if they're completely blameless, right? You are going to be associated with bad activity. So for me, one of the key challenges that we've had is, what is the reporting mechanism and what assurances can we give people that there's no one putting a thumb on the scale? Because it's not, let's be honest, it's not 6 degrees of separation in sport, especially within disciplines. Like you're talking about maybe half a degree. And I think I'm really straining the analogy here, but that's part of it in sport, is that everybody is so close. So to the extent that we can have a very clear, firm conduit for someone to come forward with complaints and even to talk to someone who is not within sport, that's really important. So you can certainly talk to sport organizations, but we really need to make sure that there is someone who is duty bound to report, to triage and to deal with a complaint. And I've seen Kristen's slides, so I know what images are going to be coming up later on. Right now, it is one of the biggest challenges that we have in the implementation of Safe Sport, is that people don't know where to go. Like if we, and forgive me, I don't have a lot of clarity on this. Pam, maybe you can speak to it more, but one of the big pieces that we're dealing with right now is, what does it mean to be a cyclist in Canada? Is there a national standard for that? Is there a single piece to go for reporting? So on this issue, if it's a crime, call 911. Do not engage the sport. You go right to the authority. There's no question. We have the duty to report on Ontario under your, if there is involving athletes under a certain age. So, if you believe that there's a reasonable risk of harm, we have a statutory obligation to report. But I think it's a big piece, and it's one of the most critical ones, that we let people know where to go. They shouldn't have to be experts on, was that maltreatment? Was I abused? Was I discriminated against? What they do need to know is, hey, this didn't feel right. This doesn't sit well. Who can I talk to about dealing with this and having it escalated if need be? Sorry for the very long-winded response to that, but it boils down to we need people to know who to turn to.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why it's important, going back to that website piece, right? And that's what it said, that, you know, there is that link there to Cycling Canada's independent third party and to that complaint submission form. But oftentimes, and that kind of leads to this next slide, oftentimes as a ride leader, as a coach, as someone who's there on the ground, if something does happen, a lot of times they're going to come to you because they're not going to know where to go. It could be a parent, it could be a participant themselves, or it could be a participant on behalf of someone else because that someone else doesn't want to say anything. So these are just some things that if someone comes to you as a leader, as a person in authority, that you have, you know, a little bit of knowledge of what to do, right? If someone comes to you, listen. That's the number one thing. Listen with empathy and be aware of your body language as they're talking to you. Be supportive. It's probably not easy that they came to you. So make sure that, you know, you're aware that it was hard for them. Be there, but also know your role, right? Whether you're a parent or guardian, a coach, a ride leader, club administrator, you're not an investigator. You know, you might not know where this is going to go. So just kind of know your role as you're listening. Let them know that you're there to help and let them know what you're going to do next. As Will said, you may have a duty to report. So don't say you're not going to say anything, right? Or say, let them know where you're going to go after that. So these are just some helpful things, and hopefully, you know, something doesn't happen, but if it does, you want to be there to help this person as they go through. And this is that duty to report. So if there is a minor in your province, you know, if anything's happening and you can protect them from further harm, that's what you want to do. You know, document what you witnessed or what you were told, and then go to Child Protection Services or the police, because we do have, being in a role that we're in sport, we do have that duty. And if you go all the way back to the beginning where we talked about the prohibited behaviors, failure to report is one of those prohibited behaviors. So if someone comes to you and reports that, then you do have to take it. You have that legal duty. So small but important. All right, we're going to flip. We are getting close to being done here. So we're just going to flip back to that kind of positive thing, right? Of how we create that environment. So Chris had shared earlier about the creating a positive sport environment. That is really important. Hopefully most of you on this call have taken either the CAC Safe Sport training. I'm going to give a little plug. I think it's fabulous. I was on the task force that helped create it. Really good. It's free, available in the locker. Respect in Sport, right? Respect Group has been around for years. They've been focusing on this before we were even talking about it, right? How to respond to bullying, abuse, harassment, and discrimination. And then we have Commit to Kids, right? And that really focuses on the abuse, the sexual misconduct and reporting. So those are all fantastic trainings. If you haven't taken them or haven't taken them all, I think that's really good. I know some mandate, but as we kind of get down to the provincial, territorial, or the local level, that's not always the case. But a lot of great information in there, and other ones in the locker. And then I want to touch on the True Sport principles. Although this seems to be something that, you know, is more new and is now getting tied in with Safe Sport, this concept has been around since the London Declaration. So we talk about the Red Deer Declaration a lot because that's when Safe Sport really came to the forefront. But the London Declaration was in 2001, and that's when CCES started this whole kind of movement with the True Sport principles, and you know, the provincial territorial ministers met to talk about sport and really about the sport that they wanted to see. So this was, you know, they had a symposium in 2003. So that was 20 years ago this was talked about, right? This isn't new. This is something that they've been trying to create. And, you know, at sport law, we often call it Sportopia, right? If we had the perfect sport, what would that look like? So the True Sport principles are kind of put in place because all the sport organizations got together and said, what do we value in sport? What do we want that to look like, right? And how do we get there? So that's where these principles were born. So we've got Go For It, Play Fair, respect others, keep it fun, stay healthy, include everyone, give back. And really, if we're all playing a role in this at all levels of sport, no matter who we are, it can help create that environment that's more positive, that, you know, doesn't leave opportunity for any of the bad stuff that we've talked about as well. And in that, just this week, CCES came out with values-based coaching, which is a true sport approach. And really their whole goal of this new e-learning module that just came out, I think it was on Monday or Tuesday of this week, was to tie in true sport and to put it into coaching and how it relates to safe sport and kind of how they go hand in hand. So I'm assuming you haven't taken that one. So that's another one. If you're looking for some more education and training, that's a great one as well. So that's a true sport, and true sport can be brought in, you know, in posters. You can commit to it. Just something easy about that kind of positive side of safe sport. Culture. And yes, I stole this from Will. So culture is so important. Obviously, whether it be a workplace, sport, team, organization, culture is huge, right? But we can talk about it all we want, but unless we're doing it, right? It's the talk you walk, right? It's not what we're thinking about. It's not what we want to do, because I can say I want this perfect environment, but unless I'm taking steps, unless I'm doing it, it's not going to happen. So all these little things we talk about, they're going to help create that positive culture, right? And it starts with all of us in a positive way, to kind of push this forward, to hold each other accountable. So we've got a few minutes for questions, but before we do that, I just want you to take a few minutes to think about what you can take away from the last, 80 minutes that we just spent on here. Our goal is that, every participant is safe, supported, and strengthened through sport. And this is in all roles. So what are some things we talked about tonight that you can take home and execute right away, right? Can you make a little change to your website? Can you change the platform that you're using to communicate with your athletes or your participants? Can you sign the True Sport pledge, as a club if you haven't done that? Or as a coach? I know I signed it originally years ago when I was a coach, before, I was even working in it in an organization. Can you take one of these new trainings that we talked about? Can you speak up when, a cyclist says something to someone else that's not appropriate? Can you provide tips, to your coaches or your ride leaders? Can you make sure that you have another rider with you when you're working with a participant? What can you do? Can you change the way you host meetings with someone? So I just want you to take a couple minutes, and then I hope some of you can share, what's something that you can do tomorrow? What's something you can do this week? What's something you can do this season that we talked about, just to make those tiny changes that will help create that positive sport environment. And yes, awesome. Thank you for those who are already dropping it in the chat box. So just take a minute now, and then I'll probably stop sharing my slides here, but just, I want you to think about that, and then hopefully a couple of you can share some of the things that you can take away and put into place right away, because that's what we want. We want things that we can do every day, tangible. Awesome. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and then I'm hoping that you get some to share. Good. So make sure policies are in place and being followed, and people are educated. Absolutely. I think that's really important, because often the policies are there and the people on the ground just don't know about them. Or they don't read. I mean, no one wants to read a policy in depth, right? So it's our job to kind of let people aware. Yeah. Absolutely. Encourage, the rule of two. When we have mixed company on team rides, absolutely. Yeah, educate yourself on true sport. Yeah. Right? Safe sport doesn't have to be daunting. It's little things that we can just do to make it a better environment, a fun environment. Keep the fun. Will, go ahead.
Am I allowed to be negative for a moment?
It depends.
I guess maybe to flip it on its head, what are the barriers to implementing Safe Sport within your organization?
I love that last comment though about the see something, say something. Yeah, awesome. Love that. I love like, Will, I'm ignoring you right now because I'm reading the comments and I love like, yes, putting them in place, setting timelines, making actual goals. But yes, then we can go back to Will's as well. Yeah, not having the buy-in. Yeah. And you know what? When I first started working in Safe Sport, probably 6 or 7 years ago, that was my first thing that I did was get the buy-in. You know, I had people come in and talk. I met with Sheldon Kennedy, right? So, and he shared his story, you know, with Allison, with different people, because people need the buy-in. They need to feel, and they need to know that it does happen. I've had so many people be like, oh, it doesn't happen in our sport. And I'm like, it does, right? So for sure, getting them in the fields, right? So that they buy in and realize how important this is. Because we want this for our sport. We want everyone to be involved in our sport and for that to continue. And if it's a negative environment, that's not going to happen.
And it's not an administrative exercise, right? Like this isn't a box that we just want people to say, I've done the training. And if we go through and you have conversations with folks and you ask them about their experience in sport, from my view, I don't, Chris, know what you think of this, but like how many people come forward with issues that they've experienced in their athletic careers that are clearly Safe Sport issues. So I think we sort of, as humans, tend to think of problems as other people, right? Like I don't have problems, they don't affect me. That's something that happens to other people. But if we have the conversation and just say, you know, what's been your experience in sport or some of the challenges, it's a really good way to humanize it and to bring it home for people of what we're trying to address is the everyday. It's not things that make it into the news, right? Like that's not what we're trying to about. Safe Sort should be about changing behaviors that are like this, not putting people in jail.
Yeah.
I've lost track of how many interruptions, but I'm sure I've exceeded my allotment of them.
No, I love it. And it's given me a chance to read some of the comments. And that's what but I think it's what you just said. It's little things that we can do and it's everybody's responsibility. And if everybody just does a little thing, it makes such a difference and it's going to stop it from being these big things, right? And that's important. So yeah, I just love it. Yeah. Getting members of the club to help with it. Yes, absolutely. Because it involves everyone, right? It's everyone's role and everybody can do something, whether it's speaking up, and just awareness and communication. I know Will talked about that before, like communication, and awareness around it. And sometimes it's just a gentle reminder of things too. So Neil, now your hand is up, but I'm not sure if it's up from before. Oh, we got both Neils now. Yeah, go ahead, unmute and. All right, well, we're kind of winding down to the last 5 minutes, but if there's any questions, you can unmute and just ask anything that we talked about or anything Safe Sport or anything going back to session 1, you know, even more on the legal side for Will. Feel free to, you know, throw any questions his way. Yeah, I know there's 2 Neils. Awesome. Well, I think that's it for me. So I really do hope that there were some things that you could take away tonight and implement right away. I will send this off to Chris tonight and he can share it. So you will have access to this information. Please feel free, you know, to reach out to myself or Will if you have any further questions. And yeah, thank you.
Huge thank you to both of you, both you and Kristen Well for doing these 2 sessions for us. I think it's really important. Oh, and you've got, if a member's made a ride later uncomfortable, can they refuse their attendance on a ride? or does that require discipline? That's a good question, actually.
Will, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Yeah.
General rule, the more serious the consequence, the more serious the process,
Yeah.
right? So, you know, and also I would say, who cares about process if someone is going to feel threatened or unsafe,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm always on the side of take action to protect people, and then we can figure out the legalities after. I've yet to see, because oftentimes I'll think of, how am I going to say this to a court? And if I have to stand up in court and say, we took immediate corrective steps to protect someone who felt threatened or unsafe in an environment, there's not a judge who's going to say this immediate, you know, it's we're not throwing someone out of the sport, but if we're saying you're not allowed to attend a ride, there's not many judges who are going to come back and say that was an unreasonable step to take. So in this, like, if someone has made someone to feel uncomfortable, I hope that we can have a conversation. If, again, there's a lot of things, power imbalance, safety, you know, to have it addressed. But at the end of the day, if someone feels that they are unsafe, that they are uncomfortable, I think they can refuse that they attend. And, you know, I would think that you would want to escalate that. And this is an example of something that maybe it's not safe sport, but we do want to address conflict. Because I think a lot of this, we do have safe sport, and it is a little bit of an inelegant tool to address issues in sport. And we have people, we have conflict.
Yeah.
One of the other pieces that we have on this, and I think really coming out of COVID, I've seen it, is that we've lost a little bit of a muscle memory or the connective tissue that allowed us to navigate disputes or annoyances with other folks. So there is a lot of work to be done about having the correspondence with people and helping address conflict that is not discipline worthy. So that was again a very long and convoluted thing, but short answer, I would say no. It does not require discipline to bar someone or to say you cannot attend. But I do think in those circumstances you need to take further steps, because you can't just say you're not welcome here and leave it, because I think that is unfair. To do it to that extreme without a recourse.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, if someone does not feel, whether the intention is there or not, it's all about how the other person receives and feels it. So I think that also has to be remembered on how we define what harassment is. So in a situation like that, it's a conversation, but you can also set down as the beginning of the year for each club ride, this is the zero tolerance behavior for us on this ride. This is the zero tolerance behavior in our club. You know, you can lay those pieces out very easily at the beginning of the year, as well as like, this is our DNA as a club, and this is what we believe in. This is how we follow things. And that even includes social media actions. We have, and again, a reminder, like I did last time, we do have all these policies that clubs can access that we're happy to provide you as a template that we've already done. And they kind of help to lay those pieces out. But I really do think it's important that you lay that expectation on behavior, no matter who you are, where you are, or what you're doing. Because, you know, an advance of some kind, like, I mean, there's a case right now where a gentleman is not in a sports sense, but is being prosecuted because of sexual interference. And his claim was that they had smiled at him. Therefore, he felt like he was being positively received. So it can be something as simple as those kind of pieces, right? So, and just because you smile at someone doesn't mean you're coming on to them or flirting. And this is, I'm talking about the adult areas now that happens on club rides, because I do hear things in the office and through emails and through things. So while people say it doesn't happen, it does, because I hear about it and see things. So again, it's just being very careful about what your goal is with your rides and your clubs. And if it's to be fun and inclusive, then you have to make sure that everybody feels that they have an equitable standing to be able to come forward and share a situation where they may not feel comfortable or someone has made them feel uncomfortable.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Sorry, my computer's slow. Yes, thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Will, for this. Again, if anybody has any questions after tonight, don't hesitate to either reach out to our office, to reach out to Kristen or Will. You know, there's obviously this is an important topic for everybody, so you know, any question that goes unasked is probably not a good thing. And yeah, like Kirsten said, we'll have the slideshow, we'll have the recordings available probably early next week. So just feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll probably email everybody with the links anyway. So you should get it. But if you don't see that email, just don't hesitate to give me a shout at the office. We'll make sure they are in your hands. So that is it for us, I think, tonight. And yeah, next webinar for any of the club directors, though members are also available if they want to come, is October 24th, where a colleague of Will and Kristen, Stephen Indig, will be talking about policies. So Safe Sport will probably come up during that conversation as well. So yeah, don't miss that. We'll promote that on our socials and through our newsletters as well. But yeah, anytime you have questions, reach out to us at the office, and hopefully you have a good rest of the evening.
And if anyone can make policies entertaining, it's Steve.
For sure. Awesome.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you
right,
so
thank
much,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.